What happens when America's most ruthless talk show host decides to destroy a guest's reputation live on national television, thinking she's found an easy target? What unfolds next isn't just television drama, it's a masterclass in how quiet strength can shatter the loudest voices. When seasoned prosecutor Elena Valdez walked onto the View stage that Tuesday morning, she had no idea she was about to become the center of a media earthquake that would expose the toxic underbelly of daytime television and prove that sometimes the most powerful response is the one nobody sees coming. The cameras were rolling, the audience was primed for blood, and Joy Behar was ready to pounce. But what happened next left a BC executive scrambling, advertisers reconsidering their partnerships, and millions of viewers questioning everything. They thought they knew about strength, dignity, and what it really means to win. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of a BC's Manhattan studios, casting long shadows across the polished floors where production assistants scurried with clipboards and coffee cups. Studio 23B, home to The View, buzzed with its usual pre-show energy, but today carried an electric undercurrent that had everyone on edge. The show's producers had been teasing this episode for weeks, promising viewers a confrontation that would make headlines. What they hadn't anticipated was just how prophetic that promise would prove to be. Elena Valdez sat in the green room, her hands folded calmly in her lap as makeup artists applied final touches to her understated but professional appearance. At 52, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms facing down hostile witnesses and skeptical juries. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore a navy blazer that spoke of competence rather than fashion. Unlike the other guests who typically graced the View stage, Elena had no book to promote, no scandal to defend, no agenda to push. She was there because a controversial court case she had prosecuted 6 months earlier was back in the headlines, and the BC's bookers thought she would make for compelling television. The case itself was complex, involving a wealthy tech executive accused of environmental crimes that had allegedly poisoned a small farming community's water supply. Elena had spent 3 years building the case, poring over scientific reports, interviewing affected families, and methodically constructing an argument that even the defendant's high-powered legal team couldn't dismantle. The guilty verdict had been unanimous, the sentence severe, and the precedent groundbreaking. But in the weeks following the trial, a well-funded public relations campaign had begun painting Elena as an ambitious prosecutor who had railroaded an innocent man for political gain. The narrative was carefully crafted and relentlessly promoted. Across social media platforms, conservative blogs, and sympathetic news outlets, Elena Valdez, they claimed, was everything wrong with the justice system, a grandstanding prosecutor more interested in headlines than truth, willing to destroy lives to advance her career. Anonymous sources alleged she had suppressed evidence, intimidated witnesses, and manipulated the media. None of these claims had any basis in fact, but in the modern media landscape, facts often took a backseat to compelling narratives. Elena had watched this character assassination unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a case study. She had seen it happen to other prosecutors, other public servants who dared to challenge powerful interests. The playbook was always the same: discredit the messenger to discredit the message. But she had also learned, through years of prosecuting difficult cases, that the truth had a way of emerging, often when least expected. The invitation to appear on The View had come through her office, framed as an opportunity to set the record straight. Elena's press secretary had been enthusiastic, calling it a chance to reach millions of viewers and counter the negative narrative. Elena herself had been more skeptical. She understood that daytime television thrived on conflict, and she suspected. She was being invited not to clarify facts but to serve as a target for the host's particular brand of aggressive questioning. Still, she had accepted. Not because she craved the spotlight, but because she believed in accountability. If she was going to be attacked, better to face it directly than to let lies fester in the shadows. She had no illusions about what awaited her. The View's hosts, particularly Joy Behar, were known for their willingness to ambush guests who didn't align with their worldview. But Elena had faced hostile juries before, had endured cross-examinations designed to destroy her credibility. She would rely on what had always served her well: preparation, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As she waited in the green room, Elena reviewed her notes one final time. She had prepared for every possible line of attack, every distortion of fact that might be thrown at her. She knew the case backward and forward, could recite key testimony from memory, and had armed herself with documentation that would refute any false claims. What she hadn't prepared for was the level of personal venom that was about to be unleashed. The green room door opened, and a production assistant with a headset and clipboard appeared. "Ms. Valdez, we're ready for you." Elena nodded, gathered her simple leather briefcase, and followed the young woman down a corridor lined with promotional posters for ABC's various shows. The assistant chattered nervously about the weather and the studio's famous guests, but Elena wasn't listening. She was entering the zone she knew well from her courtroom days, a place of mental clarity where emotion was set aside in favor of strategy and discipline. The walk from the green room to the studio felt both endless and instantaneous. Elena could hear the familiar music of The View's opening theme, the enthusiastic applause of the studio audience, and the practiced banter of the hosts as they introduced the day's topics. Through a small monitor mounted on the wall, she could see Joy Behar at the table, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to the camera. Even from this distance, Elena could sense the predatory energy that made Behar such a formidable television personality. The production assistant led Elena to a position just off stage, behind a curtain that separated the bright studio lights from the shadowy backstage area. Here, she would wait for her introduction, listening as the host set up her segment. Elena had requested to see the questions in advance, a standard practice for most television appearances, but had been told that The View preferred to keep things spontaneous. It was the first red flag, though not entirely unexpected. Through the thin fabric of the curtain, Elena could hear Joy Behar's voice rising above the others. "Our next guest is prosecutor Elena Valdez, who claims she's just doing her job. Critics say she's destroying innocent lives for her own political gain." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We'll ask her the tough questions when we come back. The words were delivered with a tone that left no doubt about Behar's intentions. This wasn't going to be an interview. It was going to be an execution. Elena closed her eyes briefly, drawing on techniques she had learned years ago for managing courtroom stress. She focused on her breathing, on the feeling of her feet planted firmly on the ground, on the knowledge that whatever happened in the next 15 minutes, it would eventually end. She had survived worse than Joy Behar's attacks. She had faced down defense attorneys who specialized in character assassination, had endured threats from powerful people who wanted her cases to disappear. A television host's bluster was not going to break her. The commercial break seemed to last forever and no time at all. Elena could hear the floor director counting down the seconds, the shuffling of papers at the host's table, the murmur of the studio audience settling back into their seats. And then, with a suddenness that always surprised first-time guests, she was being ushered onto the stage, walking across the polished floor toward the famous curved table where 5 women sat, waiting for her. The studio lights were blindingly bright, the camera lenses like unblinking eyes tracking her every step. Elena had been on television before, but never in such an adversarial setting. The audience applauded politely, but she could sense the anticipation in the air, the collective hunger for drama that daytime television audiences brought to every taping. She took her seat in the guest chair, positioned so that she faced all 5 hosts, but was slightly isolated from them, a visual reminder of her status as an outsider. Whoopi Goldberg, as the show's moderator, handled the initial introductions with professional courtesy, but Elena could see the skepticism in her eyes. Sarah N. and Alyssa Farah Griffin offered polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes, clearly prepared to follow their colleague's lead. Sunny Hostin, herself a former prosecutor, looked torn between professional solidarity and television loyalty. And then there was Joy Behar, leaning back in her chair with the confident smirk of a predator who had cornered her prey. Elena had studied Behar's technique in preparation for this appearance. The veteran host had perfected a style of attack that combines sharp wit with moral indignation, often catching guests off guard with questions that were more accusations than inquiries. Behar's specialty was finding the most vulnerable aspects of a guest's position and exploiting them mercilessly, all while maintaining the pretense of righteous journalism. She was particularly effective against guests who tried to defend themselves with facts and logic, dismissing their arguments as deflection and demanding emotional responses that could be used against them. The formal interview began innocuously enough, with Whoopi asking Elena to explain the basics of the case that had brought her into the spotlight. Elena responded clearly and concisely, outlining the charges against the tech executive, the evidence that had led to his conviction, and the impact his crimes had had on the affected community. She spoke without notes, her voice steady and authoritative, presenting the facts in the same straightforward manner she had used with countless juries. But as Elena spoke, she could see Joy Behar growing impatient, shifting in her chair, and as Elena spoke, exchanging glances with the other hosts. Behar was clearly waiting for her opportunity to pounce, and Elena knew it wouldn't be long in coming. The setup was too perfect, the narrative too tempting for someone who had built her career on taking down targets who were perceived as too privileged or too powerful. The shift came suddenly, as it always did with Behar. Without warning, the veteran host leaned forward, her voice taking on the mocking tone that had become her trademark. Elena, she began, stretching out each syllable with theatrical contempt. Do you really expect us to believe that this was all about justice? Come on, we're not stupid here. Everyone knows you're just another ambitious prosecutor who saw a rich guy and thought, there's my ticket to the big leagues. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Elena could feel the studio audience lean forward in anticipation. This was what they had come to see, the moment when the gloves came off and the real battle began. Elena had expected this line of attack, had prepared for it, but the casual cruelty in Behar's voice still caught her off guard. This wasn't just about the case anymore, it was personal. Elena took a measured breath before responding, her voice remaining calm despite the provocation. Joy, I understand that skepticism comes with your job, but I'd ask you to look at the evidence rather than the speculation. This case was built on 3 years of investigation, hundreds of witness interviews, and scientific evidence that was reviewed by multiple independent experts. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before reaching a unanimous verdict. But Behar wasn't interested in evidence or process. She had found her angle and was pressing her advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a seasoned television professional. Oh, please, spare us the legal lecture. We all know how this works. You prosecutors, you pick your targets based on politics, not justice. This poor man, this successful businessman, he became your scapegoat because you needed a high-profile conviction to advance your career. The word poor was delivered with such sarcastic emphasis that several audience members laughed, and Elena could see Behar's confidence growing. The host was playing to her base. the viewers who tuned in to see powerful people taken down a peg, and she was getting the reaction she wanted. But Elena also noticed something else, a subtle shift in the body language of some of the other hosts, particularly Sunny Hostin, who seemed uncomfortable with the direction the interview was taking. Elena tried again to redirect the conversation toward facts. "Joy, I think you're conflating accusations with evidence. The defendant in this case was convicted because he knowingly allowed toxic chemicals to contaminate a water supply that served over 3,000 families. Children got sick. Elderly people died. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury agreed. But Behar was just getting started. She had Elena in her crosshairs now, and she wasn't about to let facts get in the way of good television. Evidence? You call what you presented evidence? Come on, Elena, let's be honest here. You suppressed evidence that would have helped the defense. You intimidated witnesses. You manipulated the media to create a narrative that made this man look guilty before he ever set foot in a courtroom. Each accusation was delivered with increasing venom, and Elena could see that Behar was building toward something bigger, some devastating blow that would leave her unable to respond effectively. The allegations were all familiar from the smear campaign that had been waged against her, but hearing them delivered with such conviction on national television was jarring. Elena knew that millions of viewers were watching, many of whom had no knowledge of the actual facts of the case, and she understood that Behar's version of events was likely to be the one that stuck in their minds. The other hosts seemed to be waiting for Elena to crack, to respond with anger or defensiveness that would justify further attacks. This was the formula that had worked countless times before: provoke the guest until they lost their composure, then portray their emotional response as evidence of guilt or instability. Elena recognized the trap, but avoiding it required a level of self-control that few people possessed under such circumstances. Instead of rising to the bait, Elena responded with the same calm professionalism she brought to her courtroom work. "Joy, those are serious allegations, and I understand why you might have heard them if you've been following the coverage in certain outlets. But I'd invite you and your viewers to look at the actual court records, which are public documents. Everything I presented was reviewed by the judge, challenged by the defense, and ultimately accepted by 12 impartial jurors." The reasoned response seemed to frustrate Behar, who clearly expected more drama from her target. Elena could see the host's jaw tighten slightly, a tell that suggested she was preparing to escalate her attacks. The veteran television personality had built her reputation on her ability to provoke reactions from guests, and Elena's composure was denying her the explosive moment that would generate headlines and social media buzz. Behar leaned back in her chair, affecting a pose of casual dismissal that Elena recognized as another calculated move. "You know what, Elena? I've been doing this for a long time, and I can spot a fraud from a mile away. You sit there with your lawyer talk and your righteous indignation, but you're just another corrupt prosecutor who destroys lives for personal gain. And frankly, I think our viewers deserve better than your lies." The attack was so brazen, so divorced from any pretense of journalism, that even some of Behar's colleagues seemed taken aback. Elena could see Whoopi Goldberg's eyebrows raise slightly, and Sunny Hostin shifted uncomfortably in her chair. But the damage was done, the accusation hanging in the air like a verdict already rendered. Elena understood that this was the moment of truth, the point where she had to decide how to respond to being called a fraud and a liar on national television. For a brief moment, Elena felt the familiar surge of anger that came with being unjustly accused. She thought about the families whose water had been poisoned, the children who had suffered because of one man's greed, the 3 years of her life she had devoted to seeking justice for people who had no other advocate. She thought about the death threats she had received during the trial, the private investigators who had followed her family, the relentless pressure from powerful interests who wanted her to drop the case. But instead of lashing out, Elena drew on something deeper than anger, the conviction that had driven her entire career. She had become a prosecutor not for glory or advancement, but because she believed that everyone deserved equal protection under the law, regardless of wealth or influence. That belief had sustained her through countless difficult cases, and it would sustain her now. Elena looked directly at Joy Behar, her voice remaining steady despite the provocation. "Joy, I understand that television sometimes requires dramatic moments, but calling someone a fraud without evidence isn't journalism, it's character assassination. I've spent my career fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and I'm proud of that work. If that makes me a target for attack, so be it." The response seemed to catch Behar off guard. She had expected anger, defensiveness, or capitulation, but not this calm assertion of principle. Elena could see the host's confidence waver slightly, though she quickly recovered and pressed forward with renewed aggression. "Oh, give me a break with the saint act," Behar sneered. "You prosecutors are all the same. You wrap yourselves in the flag of justice while you ruin innocent people's lives. And when you get called out on it, you play the victim. Well, I'm not buying it, and neither should our viewers." The studio audience was riveted now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Elena could feel their eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this escalating barrage of personal attacks. Some seemed uncomfortable with Behar's aggressive tactics, while others appeared to be enjoying the spectacle. But Elena wasn't playing to the audience anymore. She was drawing on reserves of strength that had been tested in far more challenging circumstances than a television studio. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms, analyzed by media critics, and remembered as one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of daytime television. But in the moment itself, as Elena Valdez prepared to respond to Joy Behar's attacks, there was only silence, tension, and the knowledge that whatever she said next would define not just this interview, but possibly her entire legacy. The studio lights seemed to intensify, the camera lenses to zoom closer, as Elena took a breath and prepared to speak words that would change everything. Joy Behar sat back with the satisfied smirk of someone who believed she had delivered a fatal blow, while the other hosts waited to see if their colleague had finally gone too far. In living rooms across America, millions of viewers leaned toward their screens, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. Elena Valdez had spent her career in pursuit of truth and justice, facing down powerful adversaries who thought they could intimidate her into silence. She had never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered, and she wasn't about to start. Now, the only question was what form her response would take, and whether it would be enough to turn the tide of this unprecedented assault on her character and integrity. The moment stretched like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and fraught with danger. And then, with the quiet dignity that had defined her entire career, Elena Valdez began to speak. Elena's voice cut through the charged atmosphere of the studio with surgical precision, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the authority of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms where every syllable mattered. "Joy, I need to share something with you and your viewers that I've never spoken about publicly before." The unexpected opening caught everyone off guard, including Behar, whose smug expression faltered slightly as she sensed a shift in the dynamic she thought she controlled. "When I was 12 years old," Elena continued, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of something deeper, "my family lived in a neighborhood where the local factory had been dumping chemicals into our groundwater for years. My little brother Miguel developed a rare form of leukemia. The doctors couldn't explain it at first, but eventually we learned that 6 other children on our street had similar illnesses. All of them lived within a 3-block radius of our contaminated well." The studio fell silent in a way that seemed to surprise even the veteran production crew. Cameras that had been focusing on reaction shots now locked onto Elena's face, capturing an expression of controlled emotion that spoke of old wounds carefully tended but never fully healed. Joy Behar, caught completely off guard by this personal revelation, found herself in unfamiliar territory. Her arsenal of sarcastic rejoinders suddenly seemed inadequate against the raw honesty of Elena's confession. "Miguel was 7 when he died," Elena said, her voice never wavering despite the obvious pain behind the words. 7 years old, and he spent the last 6 months of his life in a hospital bed, asking me why the bad people were allowed to hurt him. I couldn't answer him then, Joy. I was just a kid myself. But I promised him, in that hospital room, that I would spend my life making sure that powerful people couldn't poison children and walk away unpunished. The impact on the studio audience was immediate and visceral. The hungry anticipation that had filled the room moments earlier evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that spoke to the fundamental shift in the interview's trajectory. Elena had done something that rarely happened on daytime television. She had introduced genuine human stakes into what was supposed to be a performance of manufactured outrage. Sunny Hostin, herself a former prosecutor, was visibly moved by Elena's revelation. Her legal background allowed her to understand not just the personal cost of Elena's story, but the professional implications of a career built on such a foundation. The other hosts exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure how to proceed in the face of such unexpected vulnerability. But Joy Behar, despite being momentarily thrown by Elena's strategy, was not about to surrender the initiative she had worked so hard to establish. The veteran host had built her career on her ability to maintain control of difficult interviews, and she wasn't going to let a sob story derail her attack, no matter how compelling it might be. "Elena, I'm sorry for your loss," Behar said, though. Her tone suggested more calculation than genuine sympathy. But personal tragedy doesn't give you the right to destroy innocent people's lives. If anything, it shows that you're too emotionally compromised to be objective about these cases. You see your brother's death in every environmental case, whether the evidence supports it or not. The response was so callous, so obviously designed to minimize Elena's pain while simultaneously using it against her, that even some of Behar's supporters in the audience seemed taken aback. Elena, however, had anticipated this reaction. She understood that Behar would try to weaponize any show of emotion, would attempt to portray vulnerability as weakness or bias. It was exactly the kind of response she had faced from defense attorneys over the years, and she was prepared for it. "You're right that Miguel's death shaped my career," Elena replied, her composure intact despite the personal nature of the attack. "But not in the way you're suggesting. It taught me the importance of following evidence wherever it leads, of building airtight cases that can withstand any scrutiny. Because when you're fighting for people who have no voice, you can't afford to make mistakes." Elena reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder, setting it carefully on the table in front of her. "This contains every piece of evidence from the case we're discussing today. Scientific reports, witness testimonies, expert analyses, defense challenges, and judicial rulings. All of it is public record, Joy. All of it can be verified by anyone. Who cares about facts more than speculation?" The presence of actual documentation seemed to shift the energy in the room once again. Elena's preparation was becoming apparent, her methodical approach standing in stark contrast to Behar's reliance on innuendo and personal attacks. But rather than backing down, Behar doubled down on her aggressive strategy, perhaps sensing that she was losing control of the narrative. "Oh, please," Behar scoffed, waving dismissively at the folder. "You think a bunch of paperwork impresses me? I've seen corrupt prosecutors manufacture evidence before. I've seen them coach witnesses and suppress anything that doesn't fit their predetermined narrative. What makes you any different?" The accusation was so broad, so divorced from the specifics of Elena's case, that it revealed the fundamental weakness in Behar's position. She was no longer engaging with facts or evidence, but simply throwing out generic attacks that could be applied to any prosecutor in any case. Elena recognized this as the moment when her opponent had overplayed her hand. "Joy, what you're describing is criminal behavior," Elena said, her voice taking on the edge she typically reserved for hostile witnesses. "Are you accusing me of manufacturing evidence, of coaching witnesses, of suppressing exculpatory material? Because those are serious criminal charges, and if you have evidence to support them, you should present it to the appropriate authorities immediately." The direct challenge caught Behar off guard once again. She had grown accustomed to guests who wilted under her attacks, who either became defensive or tried to change the subject when confronted with her accusations. Elena's decision to meet her head-on, to demand specificity rather than accepting generalized slander, was not part of the script Behar had written for this interview. "I'm not making legal accusations," Behar backtracked slightly, though her tone remained hostile. "I'm making observations based on what I've seen and what I've read about your case. And what I see is a pattern of prosecutorial misconduct that's becoming all too common in this country." Elena leaned forward slightly, her prosecutorial instincts fully engaged now. "Then let's talk about what you've actually seen and read, Joy. Can you cite a specific example of misconduct in my case? Can you point to evidence that was suppressed or witnesses that were improperly influenced? Because if you can't, then what you're engaging in isn't journalism or commentary, it's character assassination." The challenge hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, and everyone in the studio understood that this was no longer a routine daytime television interview. Elena had transformed the encounter into something resembling a cross-examination, using the very skills that had made her successful in courtrooms to expose the weakness of her attacker's position. Behar, for perhaps the first time in her long television career, found herself genuinely flustered. She had built her reputation on her quick wit and sharp tongue, but Elena's methodical approach was neutralizing her usual weapons. The prosecutor wasn't playing by the rules of television combat, where style mattered more than substance and where the loudest voice typically prevailed. "Look, I don't need to be a lawyer to see what's obvious," Behar said, her voice rising slightly as she struggled to regain the initiative. "You targeted a successful businessman because it would get you headlines. You painted him as a monster to advance your own career. And now you're here trying to justify it with legal mumbo-jumbo and sob stories about your childhood." The attack was so personal, so obviously intended to provoke an emotional response, that even Whoopi Goldberg seemed ready to intervene. But Elena remained calm, drawing on the discipline that had served her throughout her career. She understood that Behar was trying to goad her into an outburst that would discredit her and validate the host's aggressive tactics. Instead, Elena opened the folder in front of her and withdrew a single document. "Joy, this is a letter from Maria Santos, an 8-year-old girl who was hospitalized with kidney damage caused by the contamination in the case we're discussing. Would you like me to read what she wrote to the court?" The question was delivered with quiet intensity, and Elena could see that she had once again shifted the dynamic of the interview. By introducing the voice of an actual victim, she was forcing the conversation back to the human stakes that Behar seemed determined to ignore. Behar's response revealed the depth of her commitment to her attack strategy. "I'm not interested in reading letters from children who were coached by their parents and their lawyers to write exactly what you wanted them to write," she said dismissively. The callousness of the response sent a visible shock through the studio. Several audience members gasped audibly, and Elena could see looks of disgust on the faces of some of the production crew. Even Sarah Ann, typically the most diplomatic of the show's hosts, seemed stunned by her colleagues' willingness to dismiss the suffering of a child. Elena felt a surge of anger at the casual cruelty of Behar's response, but she channeled it into something more powerful, a clarity of purpose that had sustained her through every difficult case of her career. This was no longer about defending her reputation. It was about defending the principles that had guided her entire professional life. "Joy," Elena said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire studio. "I've spent my career listening to people that others have written off. Children poisoned by corporate negligence. Elderly people cheated out of their life savings. Immigrants afraid to report crimes because they don't think anyone will believe them. And in every case, there are people like you who dismiss their pain as manufactured, their suffering as convenient fiction." Elena paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "You sit behind this desk, comfortable and secure, and you attack people whose only crime is seeking justice for those who have no other advocates. You call it entertainment. I call it exactly the kind of cruelty that allows real criminals to escape accountability." The studio was completely silent now, the audience hanging on every word as Elena's response built to something that felt more like a closing argument than a television interview. Behar, clearly recognizing that she had lost control of the situation, made one final attempt to regain the upper hand. "Don't lecture me about cruelty," Behar snapped. "You're the one who destroys lives for a living. You're the one who sends people to prison based on circumstantial evidence and coach testimony. You're the one who—" "I'm the one," Elena interrupted, her voice cutting through Behar's tirade with surgical precision, "who ensures that when powerful people harm innocent victims, there are consequences. And if that threatens you or the people you care about, maybe you should ask yourself why." The implication was clear, and it landed with devastating effect. Elena had turned Behar's attacks back on her, suggesting that the host's aggressive defense of corporate criminals revealed something troubling about her own loyalties and motivations. It was a masterful piece of verbal jujitsu, using Behar's own momentum against her. The other hosts sat in stunned silence, clearly unsure how to respond to the complete reversal they had just witnessed. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate and discredit Elena Valdez had become a showcase for her intelligence, integrity, and unshakable moral conviction. Behar, meanwhile, seemed to realize that she had not only failed to destroy her target, but had seriously damaged her own credibility. In the process, Elena carefully returned the document to her folder, her movements deliberate and controlled. "I came here today because I believe in accountability," she said, addressing the camera directly now rather than engaging with Behar. "Not just for the people I prosecute, but for all of us. When we allow powerful voices to shout down truth with lies, when we let entertainment value trump human dignity, we all pay the price." The words carried a moral authority that seemed to transform the studio from a venue for manufactured conflict into something resembling a courtroom where justice was actually being served. Elena had not only defended herself against Behar's attacks but had turned the entire encounter into an indictment of the toxic culture that made such attacks possible. Behind the cameras, ABC executives were beginning to realize that they had a major problem on their hands. The interview they had expected to generate controversy and ratings was instead becoming a public relations nightmare that could have serious consequences for the network and its star host. Phone calls were already being made, crisis management strategies discussed, and damage control measures contemplated. In social media control rooms across the country, algorithms were detecting an unprecedented surge in engagement around the interview. But unlike the typical pattern of polarized responses that characterized most political content, the reaction to Elena's performance was remarkably unified. Viewers from across the political spectrum were expressing admiration for her grace, under pressure and disgust at Behar's tactics. Twitter exploded with clips of Elena's most powerful moments, each one garnering millions of views and shares. The hashtag Elena Valdez Truth began trending within minutes, accompanied by an outpouring of support from prosecutors, legal scholars, and ordinary citizens who recognized something authentic in her response to Behar's attacks. But perhaps more significantly, The interview was resonating with viewers who had no particular interest in legal issues or prosecutorial practices. Elena's story of childhood loss and lifelong dedication to justice spoke to something deeper than partisan politics, a hunger for leaders who were motivated by principle rather than ambition, who were willing to endure personal attacks rather than abandon their mission. In the studio, the interview was drawing to a close, but the impact was just beginning to be felt. Elena had not only survived Joy Behar's assault, but had transformed it into something entirely different, a moment of moral clarity that would be remembered long after the day's other news had been forgotten. As the segment concluded and the show moved to its next topic, Elena remained seated for a moment, collecting her thoughts and her materials. She had come to the studio expecting an adversarial interview, but she had not anticipated the level of personal venom that Behar had unleashed. More importantly, she had not expected to find herself defending not just her own integrity, but the very principles that made civilized society possible. The production assistants who escorted Elena back to the green room were notably more respectful than they had been earlier, their casual professionalism replaced by something approaching reverence. Word was already spreading through the studio about what had just transpired, and it was clear that everyone understood they had witnessed something unprecedented. In the green room, Elena sat quietly for a moment, processing what had just occurred. She had spent her career in high-pressure situations, but there was something uniquely draining about defending yourself against personal attacks while millions of people watched. She thought about Miguel, about the promise she had made to him in that hospital room so many years ago, and she felt a sense of peace that came from knowing she had honored that commitment once again. Her phone, which had been silenced during the interview, now buzzed with an endless stream of messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had been moved by her performance. But Elena wasn't interested in accolades or vindication. She was already thinking about her next case, her next opportunity to seek justice for people who needed an advocate. As she prepared to leave the studio, Elena reflected on the morning's events with the analytical mind that had made her such an effective prosecutor. She had faced down Joy Behar not through superior wit or television savvy, but by remaining true to the principles that had guided her entire career. In a medium that rewarded spectacle over substance, she had chosen substance. In an environment that encouraged emotional manipulation, she had relied on facts and moral conviction. The immediate aftermath would bring a firestorm of media attention, both positive and negative. There would be op-eds analyzing every word she had spoken, cable news panels dissecting her performance, and social media debates about the nature of justice and accountability. But Elena was confident that she had said what needed to be said, in the way it needed to be said. As she walked through the ABC studios toward the exit, Elena could hear the murmur of conversations stopping as she passed, could see the respectful nods of crew members who recognized that they had been present for something special. She had entered the building that morning as a target for attack. She was leaving as something else entirely. The elevator that carried her to the lobby was filled with other ABC employees, all of whom seemed aware of her identity and what had just transpired. But rather than the hostile or skeptical look she had expected, Elena saw something that surprised her: gratitude. These were people who worked in an industry that often prioritized conflict over truth, and they had just witnessed someone stand up for principle in a way that reminded them why that work could still matter. As the elevator doors opened and Elena stepped into the busy Manhattan street, she was greeted by a sight that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. A crowd of people had gathered outside the ABC building, many holding signs with messages of support for her and her work. Word of the interview had somehow spread even before the show had ended, and New Yorkers had spontaneously gathered to show their appreciation for what she had done. The crowd was remarkably diverse, reflecting the broad appeal of Elena's message. There were young activists and older professionals, immigrants and native-born Americans, People from every walk of life who had been moved by her refusal to be intimidated by Behar's attacks. They applauded as she emerged from the building, not with the manufactured enthusiasm of a television audience, but with the genuine respect of people who recognized authentic leadership when they saw it. Elena was touched by the display of support, but she was also mindful of the importance of remaining focused on her work rather than getting caught up in celebrity. She thanked the crowd briefly, emphasizing that the real heroes were the victims and families she represented, and made her way to the car that would take her back to her office. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Elena could see the crowd continuing to grow, could hear the chants of support that followed her departure. She had come to New York that morning as a prosecutor defending a controversial case. She was leaving as something much more significant, a symbol of integrity in an age of cynicism, a reminder that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The drive back to her office gave Elena time to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. She understood that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't fully anticipate, that she would be thrust into a spotlight she had never sought. But she also knew that the principles that had guided her response to Behar's attacks would continue to guide her in whatever came next. Her phone continued to buzz with messages, including several from national news organizations, requesting interviews and speaking engagements. There were offers from book publishers, invitations to appear on other television shows, and requests for comment from journalists around the world. Elena looked at each message briefly before setting the phone aside, her focus already returning to the cases on her desk and the people counting on her to seek justice on their behalf. The ABC building grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but Elena knew that what had happened there would continue to reverberate for days, weeks, and perhaps years to come. She had not just defended herself against Joy Behar's attacks. She had defended something much larger and more important. In a world where too many powerful voices use their platforms to tear down rather than build up, where entertainment value often trumped human dignity, Elena had offered a different model. As her car merged into the flow of Manhattan traffic, Elena thought once again about Miguel and the promise she had made to him. She had kept that promise in courtrooms across the country, and now she had kept it on national television as well. Whatever came next, she was ready for it, sustained by the knowledge that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds or the opposition. The morning sun that had illuminated the ABC studios was now high overhead, marking the passage of time that felt both eternal and instantaneous. Elena Valdez had walked into that building as one person and was leaving as another, not because she had changed, but because the world had finally seen who she had always been. The real test would come in the hours and days ahead, as the full impact of her confrontation with Joy Behar became clear and the forces it had unleashed continued to unfold. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. Within 20 minutes of Elena's departure from the ABC building, social media platforms across the globe were experiencing unprecedented traffic as millions of users shared, commented on, and debated the interview that had just redefined the boundaries of daytime television. The carefully orchestrated character assassination that Joy Behar had planned had backfired so spectacularly that even seasoned media analysts struggled to find historical parallels for the complete reversal they had just witnessed. In the digital command center of Twitter's headquarters in San Francisco, engineers watched in amazement as their servers strained under the weight of conversation flowing around Elena Valdez's name. The hashtag Stand With Elena was trending worldwide within 30 minutes, accompanied by a flood of video clips showing the most powerful moments of her response to Behar's attacks. But more significantly, the platform's sentiment analysis algorithms were detecting something unusual, a level of cross-partisan agreement that rarely emerged around political figures. Conservative commentators who typically dismissed prosecutors as liberal activists found themselves praising Elena's composure and moral clarity. Progressive voices who might have been expected to support Behar's aggressive tactics instead condemned them as cruel and counterproductive. Legal professionals from across the ideological spectrum shared their own stories of prosecutorial integrity, using Elena's example to highlight the importance of evidence-based justice. Even entertainment industry insiders, typically protective of their own, began questioning whether Behar's tactics had finally crossed a line that should never have been approached. The reaction was not limited to political or professional circles. Ordinary Americans who had been watching the interview shared deeply personal responses that revealed how profoundly Elena's story had resonated with their own experiences of loss, struggle, and perseverance. Parents who had lost children to preventable tragedies saw their own pain reflected in Elena's account of Miguel's death. Workers who had been harmed by corporate negligence recognized their own struggles in her fight for environmental justice. Immigrants who had faced discrimination and dismissal found hope in her refusal to be silenced by powerful voices determined to discredit her. The speed and scope of the response caught everyone off guard, including Elena herself. As her car pulled up to the courthouse where her office was located, she could see crowds of supporters already gathering on the steps, many holding signs expressing solidarity with her mission and condemnation of Behar's tactics. Local news crews were setting up equipment, and Elena realized that what had begun as a single television interview was rapidly becoming a national phenomenon with implications far beyond anything she had anticipated. Inside the ABC executive suite, panic was setting in as the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent. The network's social media monitoring team was reporting engagement numbers that dwarfed anything in the company's history, but the sentiment was overwhelmingly negative toward both the show and its star host. Advertising executives were fielding calls from major sponsors expressing concern about their association with a program that was now being widely condemned for its treatment of a respected prosecutor who had dedicated her life to protecting victims of corporate crime. The network's crisis management team convened an emergency meeting as clips from the interview continued to proliferate across every platform. What made the situation particularly challenging was that Behar's attacks had been so personal and so obviously unfair that any attempt to defend them would only generate more negative publicity. At the same time, the host was such a central figure in the network's daytime programming that any action taken against her would have serious financial and strategic implications. Phone calls were pouring into ABC's corporate headquarters from journalists, politicians, legal organizations, and advocacy groups, all demanding comment on Behar's conduct and the network's editorial standards. Several major law firms had already issued statements condemning the interview as an attack on prosecutorial independence, while victims' rights organizations praised Elena's dignified response to what they characterized as victim blaming and character assassination. The situation became even more complicated when transcripts of the interview began circulating, allowing viewers to analyze not just the dramatic moments, but the specific accusations Behar had made without evidence. Legal scholars quickly pointed out that several of her claims bordered on defamatory, particularly her suggestions that Elena had manufactured evidence and coached witnesses. The fact that these accusations had been made on national television, with millions of witnesses, created potential liability issues that the network's legal department was scrambling to assess. Meanwhile, in her modest office overlooking the courthouse plaza, Elena was experiencing the surreal sensation of watching her life transform in real time. Her staff had given up trying to answer the phones, which rang constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages of support from colleagues around the country. Her email inbox was overflowing with similar requests, along with personal messages from prosecutors who had faced similar attacks and victims, families who wanted to thank her for standing up to the kind of intimidation they had experienced themselves. Elena's chief deputy, Maria Rodriguez, knocked on her door and entered with a stack of message slips that had already grown too large to manage effectively. "Elena, I've never seen anything like this," she said, setting the papers on the desk with a mixture of awe and concern. The Attorney General's office called to express support. "The National District Attorneys Association wants to issue a statement backing you. 3 different universities have extended speaking invitations, and I stopped counting the media requests at 50. Elena looked at the messages with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. She had spent her career avoiding the spotlight, preferring to let her cases speak for themselves rather than becoming a public figure. But she understood that what had happened on The View had thrust her into a role she had never sought and could not easily escape. The question now was how to use this unexpected platform in a way that served the principles she had always fought for, rather than her own interests. "What about our current cases?" Elena asked, her mind automatically returning to the work that had always been her primary focus. "Are any of the defendants or their attorneys trying to use this morning's events to their advantage?" Maria smiled at the question, recognizing it as typically Elena to worry about her cases even in the midst of a media firestorm. That would have consumed most people's attention completely. Actually, it's had the opposite effect. 3 different defense teams have reached out to discuss plea negotiations, and 2 cases that were headed for trial are now talking about settlement. I think they realize that attacking you publicly isn't going to be as easy as they thought. The irony was not lost on Elena. Joy Behar's attempt to discredit her had actually strengthened her position in ongoing cases by demonstrating her ability to maintain her composure and integrity under the most intense public scrutiny. Defense attorneys who might have hoped to rattle her in court now understood that they were dealing with someone who could not be easily intimidated or thrown off balance. Elena's phone rang again, and Maria answered it with the weary efficiency of someone who had been fielding similar calls all day. But this time, her expression changed as she listened to the caller. "Elena, it's the producer from 60 Minutes. They want to do a profile on your career and your approach to prosecutorial ethics. They're talking about a full segment, maybe even a cover story." Elena considered the offer carefully. 60 Minutes represented the gold standard of television journalism, a program known for its thorough research and fair treatment of subjects. More importantly, it would give her an opportunity to discuss her work in depth, to explain the principles that guided her decisions, and to advocate for the victims whose stories too often went untold. After a moment's reflection, she nodded. To Maria, "Tell them I'm interested, but I want to see their research and their questions in advance. And I want them to interview some of the families from our environmental cases. This story isn't about me. It's about the people I represent." As word of Elena's growing media presence spread, the reaction at ABC became increasingly desperate. Network executives realized that they were not just dealing with a public relations crisis, but with a fundamental challenge to their programming philosophy. Elena's dignified response to Behar's attacks had highlighted the toxic nature of much daytime television, raising uncomfortable questions about the network's responsibility to maintain basic standards of decency and fairness. The situation became even more complex when several major advertisers began pulling their commercials from The View, citing concerns about the show's treatment of guests and its impact on their brand image. The financial implications were immediate and significant, with the show's advertising revenue dropping by nearly 40% in the first 24 hours after the interview aired. Joy Behar herself seemed to recognize the magnitude of her miscalculation, though her initial response was to double down on her attacks rather than acknowledge any wrongdoing. In a statement released through her publicist, she characterized Elena's response as manipulative victim-playing and accused her critics of trying to silence legitimate journalistic inquiry. But the statement only made the situation worse, as it demonstrated that Behar either didn't understand or didn't care about the ethical issues her conduct had raised. The backlash against Behar intensified when legal ethics professors began using the interview as a case study in their classes, pointing out how the host's tactics mirrored those used by defense attorneys to intimidate prosecutors and discourage them from pursuing difficult cases. Several bar associations issued statements condemning personal attacks on prosecutors as threats to judicial independence, while victims' rights organizations launched campaigns demanding higher standards for television interviews involving legal professionals. As the controversy continued to grow, Elena found herself in the unusual position of receiving support from unexpected quarters. Conservative commentators who had previously been critical of prosecutors in general praised her specific approach to environmental cases, noting that she had focused on holding corporations accountable rather than pursuing ideological agendas. Liberal voices who might have been expected to support Behar instead condemned her tactics as counterproductive to progressive causes, arguing that personal attacks on dedicated public servants undermined efforts to build broad coalitions for reform. The bipartisan nature of the support for Elena reflected something deeper than political calculations. In an era of increasing polarization and declining trust in institutions, she had offered something that transcended traditional divides. An example of principled leadership that put service above self-interest, substance above spectacle, and integrity above advancement. Her response to Behar's attacks had reminded millions of Americans of the values they wanted to see in their leaders, regardless of their political affiliations. The impact extended beyond American borders as international media picked up the story and began using it to examine broader questions about the role of aggressive journalism in democratic societies. British newspapers praised Elena's quintessentially American combination of personal strength and professional competence, while European commentators noted how her story highlighted both the best and worst aspects of American media culture. Social media platforms that had initially been overwhelmed by the volume of conversation around the interview began to see more thoughtful, long-form discussions emerge as the initial emotional reactions gave way to deeper analysis. LinkedIn became a forum for legal professionals to share their own experiences with media attacks and to discuss best practices for maintaining integrity under pressure. Facebook groups formed around Elena's example, with members sharing stories of times when they had been forced to choose between popularity and principle. The educational impact of Elena's response was particularly significant. High school debate coaches began using clips from the interview to teach students about effective argumentation and grace under pressure. College ethics professors incorporated the incident into their curricula as an example of how moral principles could be applied in high-pressure situations. Law schools scheduled guest lectures from prosecutors who had faced similar attacks, using Elena's example to prepare future attorneys for the realities of public service. In the days following the interview, Elena made a conscious decision to use her unexpected platform to advocate for broader reforms in both the media and legal systems. In carefully crafted statements and selective interviews, she called for higher standards of evidence in television journalism, better protection for prosecutors from personal attacks, and increased support for victims of corporate crimes. Her measured, fact-based approach to these issues stood in stark contrast to the inflammatory rhetoric that typically characterized such debates. The response from her fellow prosecutors was overwhelmingly positive, with many sharing their own stories of intimidation and attack from powerful interests seeking to discourage them from pursuing difficult cases. The National Association of Attorneys General issued a resolution praising Elena's exemplary demonstration of prosecutorial integrity under pressure, while several state bar associations began developing new guidelines for media interactions based on her example. Elena's impact on the legal profession extended beyond symbolic support to practical changes in how prosecutors approach their work. Several district attorneys reported that Elena's example had encouraged their staff attorneys to pursue more aggressive environmental and corporate crime cases, knowing that they could maintain their integrity even if they faced public attacks. Law schools began incorporating media training into their curricula, using Elena's interview techniques as models for how to communicate complex legal concepts to general audiences. The transformation of Elena from a respected but relatively unknown prosecutor to a national symbol of integrity had profound implications for the cases she was working on. Corporate defendants who had previously hoped to intimidate her into favorable plea bargains now found themselves facing a prosecutor whose moral authority had been strengthened by her public vindication. Several high-profile environmental cases that had been stalled in negotiations suddenly moved toward resolution as defendants realized that challenging Elena publicly was likely to backfire. At the same time, Elena was careful not to let her newfound prominence interfere with her primary responsibility to the victims and communities she served. She turned down lucrative speaking opportunities that would have taken her away from active prosecution, declined book deals that would have required her to reveal confidential case information, and consistently redirected media attention toward the families and communities affected by the crime she prosecuted. This principled approach to her sudden fame only enhanced Elena's reputation and demonstrated that her performance on The View had not been calculated for personal gain, but had emerged naturally from the values that had always guided her work. Media commentators noted that her refusal to capitalize on her moment of triumph was itself a powerful statement about the difference between authentic leadership and opportunistic self-promotion. The contrast with Joy Behar's handling of the aftermath could not have been more stark. While Elena used her platform to advocate for victims and reforms, Behar seemed primarily concerned with protecting her own reputation and justifying her conduct. Her attempts to portray herself as the victim of an unfair backlash only served to highlight the self-centered nature of her approach to journalism and public discourse. The financial implications for a BC continued to mount as advertisers remained reluctant to associate their brands with The View. Several major corporations issued statements explaining their decisions to withdraw advertising, citing their commitment to supporting positive role models and responsible journalism. The message was clear. The business community was no longer willing to subsidize programming that attacked dedicated public servants without cause or evidence. Network executives found themselves facing the choice between standing by their star host and acknowledging the fundamental problems with her approach to interviewing guests. Initial attempts to defend Behar's conduct had been met with such widespread criticism that the network was forced to reconsider its position. The situation was complicated by Behar's long tenure with the network and her contractual protections, but the financial and reputational costs of continuing to support her tactics were becoming impossible to ignore. The broader implications of the Elena Valdez phenomenon extended beyond media and legal circles to touch on fundamental questions about leadership, integrity, and public service in American society. Her example had resonated so powerfully because it offered an alternative to the cynical, self-interested approach that too often characterized public discourse. In an era when many Americans had lost faith in their institutions and leaders, Elena had reminded them of what authentic service looked like. Educational institutions began incorporating Elena's story into their leadership development programs, using her response to Behar's attacks as a case study in crisis management, ethical decision-making, and effective communication. Business schools analyzed her techniques for maintaining composure under pressure, while public administration programs examined how her principled approach to prosecution could serve as a model for other government officials. The international response to Elena's story continued to grow as foreign journalists and academics used her example to examine broader questions about democratic governance and the role of public servants in maintaining social trust. Several European universities invited her to speak about American prosecutorial practices, while international legal organizations praised her as an example of how individual integrity could transcend political and cultural divisions. As the weeks passed, the initial media frenzy began to settle into a more sustainable pattern of ongoing attention and influence. Elena carefully managed her public profile, accepting invitations to speak at legal conferences and victim advocacy events, while declining opportunities that seemed designed more to capitalize on her fame than to advance the causes she cared about. Her selective approach to media engagement demonstrated the same principled decision-making that had characterized her prosecutorial career. The long-term impact of Elena's confrontation with Joy Behar became apparent as other public servants began following her example when faced with similar attacks. Politicians, bureaucrats, and activists who found themselves targets of personal assault began responding with the same combination of dignity, evidence, and moral authority that Elena had demonstrated. Her approach became a template for how to maintain integrity under pressure while effectively countering unfair criticism. The transformation of the media landscape was more gradual but equally significant. Television producers began reconsidering the wisdom of aggressive interview tactics that could backfire so dramatically, while journalists started paying more attention to the evidence behind their accusations rather than relying solely on dramatic confrontation to generate ratings. The Elena Valdez effect, as it came to be known, represented a shift toward more responsible and substantive coverage of public figures and issues. For Elena herself, the experience had been transformative in ways she was still processing. She had always known that her work was important, but the overwhelming public response to her stand against Joy Behar had shown her that her example could inspire others to maintain their own integrity under pressure. The responsibility that came with this recognition was both daunting and energizing, pushing her to think more broadly about how her choices could influence the culture of public service. In quiet moments between cases and appearances, Elena often thought about Miguel and the promise she had made to him in that hospital room so many years ago. What had begun as a personal commitment to seek justice for vulnerable victims had evolved into something much larger, a demonstration that individual integrity could still matter in a world that often seemed to reward cynicism and opportunism. Her brother's death had shaped her career, but her response to Joy Behar's attacks showed that his memory could inspire others as well. The ongoing impact of that Tuesday morning interview continued to ripple through American society in ways both seen and unseen. In courtrooms across the country, prosecutors approached their work with renewed confidence, knowing that principled stands could be sustained even under intense pressure. In newsrooms, journalists began asking themselves whether their questions were designed to elicit truth or merely to generate controversy. In living rooms and classrooms, ordinary Americans discussed what they had learned from watching someone refuse to be intimidated by powerful voices determined to silence her. Elena Valdez had walked into a BC studios that morning as a prosecutor defending a controversial case. She had left as something much more significant, a symbol of the possibility that integrity and service could still triumph over cynicism and self-interest. The question now was whether others would follow her example, whether her moment of moral clarity could help spark a broader renewal of the values that made democratic society possible. The answer to that question would unfold over months and years rather than days and weeks, but the early signs were encouraging. Across the country, people who had been inspired by Elena's example were making their own choices to stand up for principle rather than popularity, to serve others rather than themselves, to speak truth rather than convenience. The revolution she had started was not being fought with weapons or slogans, but with the quiet determination to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. As Elena returned to her office each morning and began work on the cases that had always been her primary focus, she carried with her the knowledge that millions of people were watching and hoping that her example would continue to demonstrate that individual integrity could still make a difference. It was a responsibility she accepted gladly, sustained by the same commitment to justice that had guided her response to Joy. Behar's attacks and would guide her in whatever challenges lay ahead. The story that had begun with an attempt to humiliate and silence a dedicated prosecutor had become something entirely different, a reminder that in a world hungry for authentic leadership, the most powerful response to cruelty was often the simplest one: standing up, speaking truth, and refusing to be broken by those who sought to destroy rather than build. Elena Valdez had shown that such courage was still possible, and in doing so, she had given hope to everyone who believed that dignity could still defeat derision, that service could still triumph over self-interest, and that individual integrity could still light the way forward for a society in desperate need of genuine heroes. 6 months after the interview that changed everything, Elena Valdez stood at the window of her office, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps where supporters still occasionally gathered to show their appreciation for her work. The initial media storm had long since subsided, but its effects continued to reverberate through American society in ways both profound and subtle. What had begun as a single moment of television drama had evolved into something much more significant. A catalyst for broader conversations about integrity, accountability, and the kind of leadership a democratic society required to function effectively. The most immediate change had been in Elena's own professional environment. Her office, once a quiet backwater of the justice system known primarily to legal insiders and the families she served, had become a destination for aspiring prosecutors from across the country who wanted to learn from someone who had demonstrated how to maintain principle under the most intense pressure. Law school graduates competed for internships in her office, drawn not by the promise of high-profile cases or media attention, but by the opportunity to work alongside someone who had shown that public service could still be a noble calling. Elena had been careful to manage this influx of attention in a way that served her original mission rather than distracting from it. She established a formal mentorship program that paired experienced prosecutors with newcomers, using her unexpected platform to strengthen the entire profession rather than simply enhancing her own reputation. The program became a model for other jurisdictions, spreading across the country as district attorneys recognized the value of Elena's approach to developing ethical, effective prosecutors. The changes extended beyond her immediate office to influence prosecutorial practices nationwide. The Elena Valdez Standard, as it had come to be known in legal circles, referred to a commitment to evidence-based prosecution that put victim advocacy ahead of personal advancement. Law schools began incorporating this standard into their ethics curricula, while bar associations used Elena's example to develop new guidelines for prosecutorial conduct that emphasized both professional competence and moral courage. The impact on corporate behavior was equally significant, though less visible to the general public. Companies that had previously counted on intimidating prosecutors through media campaigns and legal harassment found themselves facing a new reality in which such tactics were more likely to backfire than succeed. Elena's demonstration that principle could withstand public attack had emboldened prosecutors across the country to pursue cases they might have previously avoided, leading to a notable increase in corporate accountability actions and environmental enforcement efforts. The environmental case that had originally brought Elena to national attention had concluded with a landmark settlement that provided unprecedented compensation to affected families while establishing new standards for corporate responsibility. In industrial pollution cases, the defendant company, recognizing that further attempts to discredit Elena would only damage their own reputation, had agreed to terms that went far beyond what anyone had thought possible before the interview. That changed everything. But perhaps the most profound impact of Elena's moment of moral clarity had been on the broader culture of public discourse in America. Her response to Joy Behar's attacks had provided a template for how public figures could respond to unfair criticism without descending into the toxic patterns that had come to characterize so much political and media interaction. Politicians, activists, And business leaders who found themselves under attack began following Elena's example, responding to accusations with facts rather than insults, maintaining their dignity while firmly defending their principles. The transformation was not universal or immediate, but it was noticeable enough to attract attention from scholars and commentators who tracked changes in American political culture. Several universities launched research projects examining what they termed the Valdez effect, studying how Elena's approach to crisis communication had influenced everything from corporate public relations to political campaign strategies. The preliminary findings suggested that audiences were increasingly responsive to authenticity and principle, even when those qualities were displayed by figures who might not traditionally be considered charismatic or telegenic. Television producers and journalists had also taken note of the lessons from Elena's interview, though their responses had been mixed. Some had embraced a more substantive approach to guest interviews, recognizing that viewers were hungry for genuine insight rather than manufactured conflict. Others had doubled down on sensationalism, but found that audiences were increasingly sophisticated in their ability to distinguish between legitimate journalism and cheap entertainment. The result was a gradual but noticeable improvement in the quality of public affairs programming, as shows that followed Elena's example of substance over spectacle began to attract larger and more engaged audiences. Joy Behar herself had never fully recovered from the reputational damage caused by her treatment of Elena. While she remained on The View, her role had been significantly diminished as the network sought to distance itself from the toxic approach that had generated such negative publicity. Several of her most aggressive interviewing tactics had been quietly discouraged by producers, and guest bookings for the show had become more challenging as potential interviewees and their representatives remembered how Elena had been treated. The financial impact on both Behar and the network served as a powerful reminder to other media personalities that there were real consequences for crossing the line from tough journalism into personal attack. The advertising boycott that had followed Elena's interview had never fully lifted, with several major corporations maintaining their decision to avoid programming that they considered inconsistent with their values. This market-based accountability had proven more effective than regulatory approaches in encouraging higher standards of broadcast journalism, demonstrating that consumer pressure could drive meaningful change in media practices when audiences made their preferences clear through their viewing and purchasing decisions. Educational institutions had perhaps been the most enthusiastic adopters of Elena's example, incorporating her story into curricula ranging from journalism ethics to leadership development to crisis communication. Business schools used her response to Behar's attacks as a case study in reputation management, while public administration programs highlighted her approach as a model for how government officials could maintain their integrity while effectively communicating with the public. The popularity of these educational applications suggested that Elena's impact would continue to influence new generations of leaders long after the initial media attention had faded. International observers had continued to follow Elena's story with interest, using her example to examine broader questions about democratic governance and civic leadership. Several foreign journalists had profiled her as representative of American values at their best, while academic conferences in Europe and Asia had featured presentations analyzing her communication techniques and their applicability to other cultural contexts. The global attention had made Elena somewhat uncomfortable, as she remained focused on her local responsibilities, but it had also demonstrated the universal appeal of principled leadership in an age of cynicism and opportunism. The personal cost of her sudden fame had been significant, though Elena had managed it with the same disciplined approach she brought to her professional responsibilities. Death threats from extremists who viewed her as a symbol of government overreach had required enhanced security measures, while the constant attention from supporters and critics alike had made simple activities like grocery shopping more complicated. She had been forced to develop new routines and boundaries to protect her privacy and maintain her focus on the work that had always been her primary concern. Elena's family had also had to adjust to their unexpected prominence, with her elderly parents finding themselves the subject of media attention they had never sought or desired. Her mother, in particular, had struggled with the knowledge that her daughter was the target of hatred from people who knew nothing about her character or motivations. Elena had worked hard to shield her family from the worst aspects of public scrutiny while helping them understand why her stand against Joy Behar had resonated so powerfully with so many people. The legal cases that had originally prompted Elena's television appearance continued to influence her reputation and work. Several environmental groups had approached her about taking on similar cases in other jurisdictions, recognizing that her moral authority and proven resilience made her uniquely qualified to challenge powerful corporate interests, while Elena had turned down most of these opportunities in order to focus on her existing responsibilities. She had provided advice and support to prosecutors in other states who were pursuing similar cases. The precedent set by Elena's environmental prosecution had been cited in dozens of subsequent cases, establishing new legal standards for corporate accountability that had far-reaching implications for industrial practices across the country. Law schools now taught the case as an example of how effective prosecution could create lasting change beyond the immediate punishment of wrongdoers, demonstrating the broader social value of holding powerful actors accountable for their actions. Elena's approach to victim advocacy had also evolved in response to the platform her television appearance had created. She had used her enhanced visibility to advocate for legislative changes that would strengthen protections for environmental crime victims while ensuring that prosecutors had the resources and authority needed to pursue complex corporate cases effectively. Her testimony before congressional committees had been widely praised for its combination of technical expertise and moral clarity, leading to bipartisan support for several reform measures that might have languished without her advocacy. The speaking invitations that had flooded Elena's office in the immediate aftermath of her interview had settled into a more manageable pattern, though she remained selective about which opportunities she accepted. She prioritized events that would advance her core mission of victim advocacy and prosecutorial reform, turning down lucrative commercial opportunities that seemed designed more to capitalize on her fame than to serve constructive purposes. This principled approach to her public platform had only enhanced her reputation and demonstrated that her performance on The View had been authentic rather than calculated. Corporate whistleblowers had begun reaching out to Elena with increasing frequency, recognizing her as someone who would take their concerns seriously and pursue them with the kind of determination that had characterized her environmental cases. While she could not take on every case that was brought to her attention, Elena had worked to connect these potential witnesses with prosecutors in appropriate jurisdictions, while advocating for stronger legal protections for those who reported corporate wrongdoing. The mentorship requests from young prosecutors had become so numerous that Elena had been forced to develop a systematic approach to managing them. She had established partnerships with several law schools to provide guest lectures and workshops, while creating an online resource center that made her insights and experiences available to a broader audience. The demand for this kind of guidance had demonstrated the hunger among young lawyers for role models who embodied the highest standards of professional ethics and personal integrity. Elena's influence on prosecutorial training programs had extended beyond her immediate sphere to influence national standards for continuing legal education. Bar associations had begun requiring training in media relations and crisis communication, recognizing that modern prosecutors needed to be prepared for the kind of public scrutiny that Elena had faced. Her techniques for maintaining composure under pressure while effectively communicating complex legal concepts had become standard elements of these training programs. The broader cultural impact of Elena's stand against Joy Behar continued to manifest in unexpected ways throughout American society. Social media platforms had noticed a shift toward more constructive engagement when users invoked Elena's example, with her name becoming associated with principled discourse rather than inflammatory rhetoric. Online communities dedicated to civic engagement and public service had grown significantly, often explicitly citing Elena's example as inspiration for their members' commitment to constructive participation in democratic processes. Political candidates from both major parties had begun attempting to associate themselves with Elena's brand of principled leadership, though she had remained scrupulously nonpartisan in her public statements and had declined all requests to endorse candidates or causes that went beyond her professional expertise. This political neutrality had only enhanced her moral authority and demonstrated that integrity could transcend partisan divisions in ways that few contemporary figures had managed to achieve. As Elena reflected on the 6 months that had passed since that transformative Tuesday morning, she found herself both humbled by the response to her actions and energized by the opportunities they had created to advance the causes she had always cared about most deeply. The promise she had made to Miguel in that hospital room had evolved from a personal commitment into something much larger, a demonstration that individual integrity could still inspire collective action in service of justice and accountability. The work continued, as it always had, with new cases bringing fresh challenges and opportunities to seek justice for those who had been harmed by corporate negligence or environmental crimes. But now that work carried additional weight, as Elena understood that her example was being watched and followed by prosecutors across the country, who had been inspired by her demonstration that principle could prevail over pressure, that substance could triumph over spectacle, and that individual courage could still make a difference in an often cynical world. The morning sun continued its climb across the courthouse plaza, illuminating the words carved in stone above the building's entrance: equal justice under law. For Elena Valdez, those words represented not just an aspiration, but a daily commitment, one that had been tested on national television and had emerged stronger for the trial. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she faced them with the confidence that came from knowing that integrity, once proven under fire, could serve as an unshakable foundation for whatever battle still needed to be fought in the ongoing struggle for justice and accountability in American society. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.